We address here the next claim, which Dan Gibson raised in his book, page 234, where he wrote, "The Holy City produced large armies. Apparently, Mecca had no trouble in raising large numbers of men to work large caravans and march in their armies." The following chart is information gleaned from Al-Tabari's history. Dan Gibson presented a table. I'll read in the bottom row. He said, Year 5, Battle of the Trench, associated tribes. In front of it, he put 10,000 Quraysh soldiers. Then he wrote under the table, when one considers the number of soldiers and camels that the Meccan could raise despite their losses in battles year after year, one would expect the Holy City to be a large city. However, archaeological evidence points to Mecca being a small place in a harsh environment. How then could it have produced such armies? End of extract from Dan Gibson book. The biggest Meccan Quraysh army Dan Gibson presented in his table is the Battle of the Trench, when 10,000 soldiers attacked and seized the Muslims in Medina. Dan Gibson knows very well, as he wrote in his table, Associated Tribes, that this battle was also called the Battle of the Confederates, because it was an alliance between Banu Nadir, Ghatfan, Quraysh, Banu Asad, and Salim. Total of all these allied tribes was 10,000 soldiers. But Dan Gibson wrote in the table 10,000 Quraysh soldiers. The time Quraysh may have contributed only 3,000, maybe 4,000 soldiers only. Dan Gibson showed in page 312 of the book a map naming the tribes, as I listed them above, that laid siege to Al-Madinah, but he did not list Banu al-Nadir, although Banu Nadir were the one who initiated, gathered, and organized the whole alliance. So Mecca did not produce 10,000 soldiers, and although Dan Gibson knew that very well, he claimed that Quraysh alone produced this number, yet in the map in page 312, he also showed they didn't. Dan Gibson also said, apparently, Mecca had no trouble in raising large numbers of men to work large caravans. End. What large number of men and what large caravans? That caravans, as we showed before, are only 2 journeys per annum, one in the winter and one in the summer. How many men you need to support one caravan at any given time? We move now to the second claim. In response to Al-Humaymah, claim 7, Dan Gibson alleged that the messenger, peace be upon him, received the holy revelation in Petra, and that the Quraysh tribe were living in a village called Al-Humaymah, 45 kilometers south of Petra, and that all the events of the dawn of Islam took place in Petra and not in Mecca. He said the Abbasids, or the Abbasid, came from Humaymah. However, historians told us that the Umayyad Caliph, Al-Walid bin Abdul Malik, gave Al-Humaymah to Ali bin Abdullah bin Abbas in the year 95 Hijri, which is equivalent to 713 AD. Ali built a palace in it, and many of his relatives joined him and made Al-Humaymah their home. So the Abbasids only moved to Al-Humaymah after the year 95 Hijri. Before that year, there were no Abbasids nor Quraysh in Humaymah. Now we go to the claim about the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. In page 235 of Quranic Geography, Dan Gibson said, questions concerning Abraham and Ishmael. If Islamic sources are correct in saying that Abraham journeyed to Mecca, it is surprising that there is no reference to this event in the biblical history. It would have required many months of difficult travel. End of extracts from Dan Gibson. First question that comes to mind: why the writers of the Old Testament will want to record anything that glorifies Ismail alayhi salam, the son of Hagar? They ignored him, and the little they wrote about his descendants was not good. So why Dan Gibson is surprised? Second, Ibrahim alayhi salam is known, according to the Old Testament, to travel to faraway places. He traveled from Ur to Haran, from Haran to the Jordan River Valley. Then he traveled to Egypt and back. So he could have easily joined a trading caravan heading south to Yemen and left them near the valley of Mecca. The caravan trip would have taken 6 weeks to reach Mecca, not as difficult as Dan Gibson implied. However, as Dan Gibson brought the Old Testament here, the question that needs an answer is, where is the great nation that God promised it will come out from the descendants of Ismail? In Genesis 17:20, God said to Abraham, "And as of Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." End. And as also written in Genesis chapter 21:18, when the angel spoke on the name of God to Hagar, when she and her child were left in the desert suffering thirst and despair, the angel said, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation." End. So where is the great nation that God promised it will come out of the descendants of Ishmael? The Old Testament is silent about this nation, but the answer is clear. The descendants of Ismail established the nation of Islam. Islam is the promised great nation. Now we reach Dan Gibson's last claim, that all the mosques of the first Hijri century, their qiblas were directed accurately towards Petra, not Mecca. The claim that the first century qiblas were oriented towards the unspecified location in the northwest of the Arabian Peninsula was previously raised by Dr. Patricia Krohn and her colleague Dr. Cook. Islamic Awareness in 2001 responded with a scientific article published in 2001. At that time, Dan Gibson's book and research were not yet published. Following is the summary quoted from Islamic Awareness, as mentioned at the end of their comprehensive study they published on their website. Address of the study is listed here under. Here is the extract from Islamic Awareness. Conclusion. It was claimed by Krohn, Cook, and Smith that the early mosques pointed towards an unnamed sanctuary in northern Arabia, or even close vicinity of Jerusalem. However, a closer analysis using the modern tools available to us show that the qiblas of early mosques were oriented towards astronomical alignments. Winter sunrise for mosques in Egypt, and winter sunset for mosques in Iraq. It was shown conclusively that the early mosques do not point at northern Arabia or even close vicinity of Jerusalem. We also added the study of 12 early mosques in Negev highlands to support our conclusions. In the early centuries of Islam, Muslims did not have tools to determine the Qibla with precision. Only from 3rd century onwards, mathematical solutions for determining Qibla were available. Even then, their use was not widespread. The folk astronomy retained its strength as suggested by various mosques in Cairo, Cordova, and Samarkand. This gave rise to various directions of Qibla, sometimes way off from the true direction, and Allah knows best. End of extract from Islamic Awareness. This is what the researchers in Islamic Awareness published in July 2001. After they conducted a comprehensive scientific study, this was before Dan Gibson started examining the directions of these same mosques. If he had read it, he would have saved himself the trouble of researching and saved us the trouble of responding. But he spent 10 years in his research, which he published in a book in 2011, the summary of which is that he found that the qiblas of all the mosques that were built in the first Hijri century were directed precisely towards Petra. These mosques included a mosque in China. He claimed that it was built in the year 627 AD. That's the 5th Hijri year, 5 years after Hijrah. And that the companion, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, went to China, which is around 8,000 kilometers away, and preached Islam there. And apparently they accepted and became Muslims. So he built a mosque for them there in Guangzhou, Canton, and made the direction of its qibla precisely towards Petra. However, we have not heard from any of the reliable Islamic sources that any of the companions spread Islam in China in the 5th Hijri year. That is, 3 years before the conquest of Mecca, and 3 years before the spread of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. Considering the time needed to travel all the way to China, preach Islam, establish a community of believers, and build the foundations of the mosque, Abu Waqqas must have left Medina 3 or 4 years before. That is, before the Battle of Uhud, perhaps even before the Battle of Badr, and perhaps before the Qibla conversion back to the direction of Mecca, when it was still towards Bayt al-Maqdis, Jerusalem. So even if we took this story as true, which we definitely know it is not, Abu Waqqas, when he left Mecca, the Qibla was towards Jerusalem. From Guangzhou, at 8,000 kilometers away, Jerusalem and Petra are same at the same Qibla directions. I do not think that the Muslims at that time were putting their efforts towards preaching Islam in a faraway China, because they were fully involved in defending their faith and fighting for their own survival in and around Al-Madinah. We reach here the end of this episode till we meet again, insha'Allah. Next episode, its title is Their Claim That Qiblas of First Century Mosques Were Oriented Towards Petra. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel and share this video with your friends. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.